All right, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Estabrook's Excellence in Education, Part 2. We are here with contextualization today, so let's get into it. Contextualization, right? This is going to be defined as historical thinking skill that involves the ability to connect historical events and processes to specific circumstances of time and place, as well as broader regional, national, or global processes, right? So the key part about this, it's a historical thinking skill. You want to connect, right? Contextualization is all about connecting. It's all about understanding, right? This is what we're really kind of focusing on. How do we connect different objects to other objects to better understand certain things? This is all about finding connections. How do things relate? You need context to answer the question, right? The easiest way to kind of explain this is think about context clues, right? When you're reading a sentence and you don't understand a word, think about how you use the context clues around it, use the words around it to help you better understand what the word means. Without the context clue, it doesn't mean that you can't read the word, but it does mean that you potentially can't understand the word. It's the same thing with an essay, right? Contextualization-wise. If I give you an essay, you can read it, and you probably can have a general understanding of what the essay is about. It doesn't mean that you actually understand the historical significance of the essay because you don't have the contextualization. Right? History is a storybook. Remember that, whether you're in my class, any other class, history, the study of history is one large storybook. Chapter 1 all the way up to the end, right? And it may not be clear cut how chapter 1 is going to connect to chapter 17, but chapter 1 does connect to chapter 17. There's a line that you need to draw between these things, and that's where contextualization comes into play. How do you draw the line from point A to point B to better understand what point B is? You can read point B, you can study point B, but point B isn't as significant if you don't have point A, and that's your contextualization. Put your contextualization in your introduction, right? Set the stage to your essay. You want the contextualization to be relevant to the topic. By just providing the background information doesn't mean you're going to get the point, right? A big piece to kind of jot down that I had here. Most of the things on the AP exam are going to tell you you are not going to get the point from merely a reference or a phrase, right? Just briefly stating something isn't good enough. Why is it not good enough? Because you are an AP student. You are smart, you are capable, you are talented, and they want to know that you have knowledge of something, right? Just briefly mentioning something in one sentence, no matter what on the AP exam, whether it's evidence, whether it's analysis, whether it's contextualization, whether it's complexity, it's not going to get you the point, right? You have to show them that you have knowledge, and you do that with detail. So the same thing with contextualization. Again, make sure contextualization is relevant to the topic. Just because you're talking about history doesn't mean you're going to get the contextualization point, right? It has to be a relevant piece of information. AP has 4 key thinking skills: causation, continuity and change over time, comparison, and synthesis or complexity. You need to do one of these things when you're answering an essay question, and contextualization is going to help with that, right? That's causation, continuity and change over time, comparison, and synthesis or complexity. All right, so now looking at contextualization a little bit more specifically here. All right, I suggest to you, you can do before, during, or after when you're talking about your contextualization. I suggest doing before or after. The issue with during, right, is the fact that if you talk about during, there's a chance that you're going to repeat yourself. You do not want to talk about something that is in your contextualization in your paper. Example I jotted down here, right? If you have a question that asks you to analyze the role of democracy in America's identity between 1780 to 1815, and I talk about the Constitution as a piece of evidence for how democracy is important, I do not want to put contextualization in my, or I do not want to put the Constitution in my contextualization, because my contextualization is a broad overview. It's not the specific of what I'm talking about in my paper. It's just a broad overview. So again, if I'm answering a question about analyzing the role of democracy in America's identity between 1780 to 1815, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Britain's policy of salutary neglect and the pushback that led to the American Revolution once the colonists realized they didn't have full control of their lives because of the acts the British passed, right? Broader topic, how does democracy tie into the role of American identity? Well, if I'm leading into 1780, I'm talking about the fact that the colonists of America realized that this control they felt they had over themselves because of salutary neglect was actually non-existent once Britain passed these different policies. That also gives you specifics. You want specific within your contextualization. I mentioned salutary neglect. I mentioned British policies. I mentioned colonists, right? That is what you want. You want to have specific direct information, again, to show that you have knowledge. If I'm doing before or after, I'm going to talk about 20 to 30 years before, 20 to 30 years after. I'm going to try to summarize those things. For example, if I'm going to talk about the after part of that question about democracy in America, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about Jacksonian democracy, right? Jacksonian democracy is going to happen after that 1815 deadline, right? And the significance of Jacksonian democracy, in this case, it's going to give people greater opportunity to vote. It's going to be more laissez-faire economic policy by the government. And the way you tie that in is you're going to basically imply that the time period 1780 to 1815 is going to lead into an even greater time of democracy. And how I would phrase this is basically that 1780 to 1815, it's going to be important to highlight that the country was growing very early on, right, in 1800s, and they couldn't jeopardize kind of its growth. America was afraid that it was going to fail early on, and that's why they restricted some of these democratic rights. Now, they were more democratic than what they had when they were in England, but they weren't as democratic as during the Jacksonian democracy. And so I think the Jacksonian democracy is a good piece to point to the aftermath of it and say, listen, this is where America is going to get to following the period of 1815, and now let me give the general context of what was happening before that, so you better understand how it leads into Jacksonian democracy. All right, and now just to give you two examples of a good piece of contextualization and a bad piece of contextualization. The question, right, evaluate the extent to which the Civil War fostered change in the United States economy in the period from 1861 to 1900. Evaluate the extent to which the Civil War fostered change in the United States economy in the period from 1861 to 1900. So we're talking about Civil War fostering change in the economy 1861 to 1900. Right, so how basically right around the beginning of the Civil War to a little bit post-Civil War, Second Industrial Revolution, how does the Civil War lead to change in the United States economy? So if we look at the board, we can kind of look at a good example here. Throughout the first half of America's 19th century, the country was going through the market revolution. The nation was developing a national economy as internal improvements sprung up connecting the country with canals and railroads. Amidst this economic change, sectional tensions rose. So you can look at specifics, right? Throughout the first half of American 19th century, country was going through the market revolution. You always want to have a specific thing that you're latching onto. Developing a national economy, right? It's addressing the idea of economy. How has the economy changed? How did it foster change? Now it's a national economy. Internal improvements, right? Connecting the country with canals and railroads. Right, so now this is building into the question. The question is going to ask about 1861, 1900. So this is before contextualization. Right, this is going to set the stage where now in your essay you're going to be able to kind of elaborate on this. Right, how is the market revolution showing up in 1861 and 1900? What role does the market revolution have in the Civil War? What about these internal improvements? What about the canals and the railroads? What role does the railroads have during the Civil War, after the Civil War, in terms of developing America? Right, so I'm setting the stage. The question's asking about how the Civil War fostered change. How can I show an understanding of what's going to set the stage for the Civil War, right? Pre-Civil War. So this is my pre-Civil War argument about the direction that the country is going. So now I can better understand and better argue, well, here's where the country is during and post-Civil War because of the situation and the setup the country had going into Civil War, right? And again, have that specific. Market revolution, internal improvements, canals and railroads, right? Have direct claims. I even have administering this amidst this economic change, sectional tensions rose, right? So I've now been connected further. As this stuff is happening, it's leading into the Civil War, right? I'm setting my stage for the paper that I'm going to write. All right, and then here's an example of contextualization that does not work. Again, same question, right? We're looking at Civil War fostering change in the economy, 1861, 1900. This person said, factories continue even beyond 1900 for the same purpose, making materials necessary for war and civilian life. Clearly, this is just too broad, right? The idea there isn't a lot of specifics there. They do try to tie in specific for war and civilian life, but it's just a really broad claim, right? Factories continue even beyond 1900 for the same purpose, making materials necessary for war and civilian life. There's just not a clear enough connection for someone to better understand the broader picture of the influence of the change in the economy during this time. Since this is addressing kind of after 1900, there's just not enough of specific connection to kind of highlight what's going on. So again, with contextualization, just make sure that you are addressing the topic, that you are adding to the topic, right? Don't just give history, add to the topic, make sure it's relevant. Give contextualization. Going back to that word, right? Do you understand what you read, right? How is what your contextualization piece is? How is that going to better highlight what the rest of the essay is talking about, so that way someone can better understand your essay, just like someone's better trying to understand a word in a sentence. So contextualization is key. It sets up the paper. It sends the paper in the right direction. It shows the reader that you have knowledge beyond the topic. And it certainly is going to add some complexity to your paper. All right, thanks, and I'll see you again next time.